Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido. Back in 1997, Simon & Schuster did something unique. They published a Star Trek novel. It was written by Peter David. It was entitled House of Cards. But it was unlike any other Star Trek novel that had ever been published before because it didn't tie directly into one of the, at the time, 4 extant Star Trek series. It featured a new crew, a new ship, and the adventures of what was billed Star Trek New Frontier would be about them. Captain Mackenzie Calhoun and the crew of the U.S.S. Excalibur. That crew included some characters who had appeared on television before, Elizabeth Shelby, who appeared in the Best of Both Worlds two-parter, Robin Leffler, who appeared in the episodes Darmok and The Game on Next Generation, and one other Next Generation guest star, Dr. Solar, who appeared in the episode The Schizoid Man. And Peter also had written 3 young adult novels that were called Worf's First Adventure, and there were 2 other novels that I don't remember the titles of now, but they were young adult books that portrayed Worf's first couple of years at Starfleet Academy. And several of the characters who appeared in that, his Academy classmates were also made part of the Excalibur crew. Soleta, a Vulcan woman, Mark McHenry, who was a bit eccentric, and Zach Kebrin, who was a Brickar, which was a basically giant guy made out of rock, more or less, who was Worf's roommate, specifically. One other character named Tania Tobias was there, although she was not made part of the Excalibur crew, but she was in the New Frontier books. She did eventually show up in the New Frontier books, but that was after the story I'm about to read. In the novel series, the New Frontier novel series was a great success for quite some time. Peter wrote over a dozen novels in the New Frontier series that proved incredibly popular and incredibly well liked. And in 2003, it was decided to open things up a little bit and let other people take a shot at writing the New Frontier characters. Because a lot of people really enjoyed it and wanted to do that. So Peter put together, with some help from me, the New Frontier anthology, No Limits, which came out in the fall of 2003. And basically it did solo stories featuring the various individual characters in the New Frontier series. A whole bunch of people did stories. Dayton Ward, Robert Greenberger, Susan Schwartz, David Mack, Susan Wright, Josepha Sherman, Ilsa J. Bick, Kevin Dillmore, a bunch of other people who all did stories featuring various characters. And I also, like I said, I helped Peter edit the anthology, and I also wanted to do a Soleta story. Soleta was revealed in the New Frontier series to not be a Vulcan, as she originally thought, but in fact a half-Vulcan, half-Romulan was actually the product of a rape. And what I wanted to do was the story where she found that out, when she first learned of her parentage, and so, which had been discussed in the New Frontier series, but not actually dramatized. And it also gave me a chance to write the character of Worf when he was a brash young ensign. He and Soleta and Tania Tobias all serving together. I also wanted to do something with Tobias because she was the one character from Peter's YA books that nothing had been done with. The one other thing that I did that did not wind up in the final book, I did a framing sequence. At the time that we were doing these books, Worf was the Federation ambassador to the Klingon Empire, which he had been made at the end of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He eventually wound up back in Starfleet in the movie Star Trek Nemesis, but there's a 4-year period there where he served as the Federation's ambassador to the Empire. And I had actually written several stories. I had a few other people about Worf's time as a diplomat. And I wanted to do a story that had basically a class reunion among Worf, Soleta, McHenry, and Kebrin. And so I wrote a framing sequence that did that. It wound up getting cut from the book. As you can see, No Limits was a very thick book. And we actually had to cut one story, and we were also running tight on space. So I very reluctantly cut the framing sequence from the story. But we have no such constraints here now, so I'm going to read you the original manuscript. This is the director's cut of my story, Revelations, from the New Frontier anthology, No Limits. Stardate 53405.2. Captain Calhoun used the bat'leth to block another attack as he kicked his foe in the side. Next to him, Ambassador Worf ran his own foe through with Calhoun's sword, a yellow ichor staining the long blade as he yanked it from the creature's belly. Calhoun didn't recognize these spiny-backed creatures that they faced in this jungle, but they did bleed a rather garish shade of yellow. Hope it comes off easily, or the Ambassador and I will be having words. The creature took another swing with its two-bladed axe, and Calhoun again deflected it. The weapon shook a bit in his hands, but the vibrations were distributed evenly across the crescent-shaped weapon, so he was in no danger of losing his grip. Calhoun had never used a bat'leth before, but he was now starting to appreciate what the Klingons saw in it. At first he was wielding it as a one-handed weapon, gripping it at one end of the crescent like he would his sword, and while the bat'leth was designed so it could be held that way, it was not the ideal grip either. He soon got the hang of using it two-handed, cradling it in the crook of his arm to defend against strokes aimed at his side, and utilizing it as both a club and a slicing weapon. Now Calhoun shoved the bat'leth downward, taking the creature's axe with it. The creature howled its disapproval as it lost its grip. Calhoun whirled the bat'leth upward. One of the double points jabbed into the creature's neck. Yellow ichor spurted in all directions, narrowly missing Calhoun's eye and staining both his uniform and the bat'leth. I really hope this gun comes off. After yanking the blade out of the creature's throat, Calhoun turned to see how the Ambassador was faring. Worf obviously had more familiarity with this type of weapon than Calhoun did with the bat'leth. The sword, which had been used by a since-killed enemy to cut open Calhoun's face, from which the captain still bore the scar, was one of Calhoun's most precious keepsakes. He only let Worf use it because the Ambassador was returning the favor. The bat'leth Calhoun held was the only remaining heirloom of Worf's family after the massacre at Khitomer 30 years ago. Now Worf was holding off two more of these spiny-backed creatures, one of which had an earth mace, the other a Vulcan lirpa. The axe Calhoun's foe had was a Bolian design. For a bunch of yellow-blooded spiny things, they sure do have eclectic tastes. Calhoun ran over to where Worf stood and slammed the bat'leth into the back of the mace wielder. The creature leaned back and screamed, an ear-piercing sound that surprised Calhoun more than the movement and caused him to lose his grip on the bat'leth, still lodged in one of the spinal ridges. The creature swung its mace around, mistakenly believing that Calhoun was helpless just because he had been disarmed. Calhoun thrust his left arm out so that it caught the chain that linked the mace handle to the large, spiked metal ball, causing the ball to veer from its intended trajectory, to wit, Calhoun's head. Even as the chain started to wrap around Calhoun's arm, the captain slammed the heel of his hand into the creature's nose. It fell backward onto the ground, losing its grip on the mace. Arms and legs shooting upward, accompanied by another keening wail, the impact of the landing drove the bat'leth blade deeper into its back. After a moment of that, it didn't move at all. Calhoun turned to see the Ambassador standing over the last of the creatures, its lirpa snapped in two at the creature's feet. Worf's left boot lodged firmly on the creature's throat. The Klingon wore an ankle-length leather coat over a dark brown tunic and black pants. The jacket was decorated with the emblems of both the Federation and the Klingon Empire, and, at present, a not inconsiderable amount of yellow. Still, except for the stains of the creature's life's blood, the Klingon didn't have a hair out of place. He hadn't even appeared to have broken a sweat. Calhoun, on the other hand, had several tears in his uniform, which was covered in a not inconsiderable amount of blood. "I could easily have handled both of them," the Ambassador said. Calhoun heard no boast in his tone, only a statement of fact. "I'm sure you could have, but I was getting bored waiting." He rolled the creature over and yanked the bat'leth out of its back with his right hand. His left arm was still encumbered with the mace. "Nice piece of hardware." "Your own piece of hardware is nice as well, Captain. Excellent balance, good grip, and a strong blade." "Glad you approve. The real question is how we get this crap off it." The Ambassador did not smile, but Calhoun did note that his lips curled a tiny amount. "It will be the work of 3 words. Computer! End program." At that command, the creatures disappeared, followed by the jungle, and the blood on their weapons and uniforms. As an added bonus, the mace was no longer wrapped around his arm. I keep forgetting I'm on a holodeck, Calhoun thought, looking at the yellow and black gridwork of the bulkheads and floor of holodeck 1. He had honed his fighting instincts on the killing fields of his homeworld of Xenix, when he led his people to overthrow Danteri oppression. Even after all these years in Starfleet using holographic technology, the idea of removing all traces of battle with a virtual handwave was not one he could accustom himself to. His uniform was still stained, of course, but now it was only with his own sweat. Should have worn something more practical. Not a bad program, Calhoun said. Decent workout. Mind if I keep a copy? Worf hesitated. Something wrong? I have shared the higher levels of this program with only 2 people. Both were my mates. Smirking, Calhoun asked, does that mean I have to marry you to get you to share the program? No. Good. For one thing, I'm already married. And you're really not my type. I prefer a partner who's more aggressive. He turned to the wall. Computer, exit. Again, the lips curled. Given that you married Captain Shelby, I do not find this surprising. As they exited the holodeck, Calhoun chuckled. That's right, you served with her back on the Enterprise back in your Starfleet days. Yes. Calhoun had expected some kind of elaboration on this. Perhaps a lengthy recitation of the great deeds that he, Shelby, and the Enterprise crew performed in battle against the Borg. He knew Klingons loved that sort of thing. But Worf apparently saw no need to do so. I think I like this guy. Worf, the Federation's ambassador to the Klingon Empire, had boarded the Excalibur at Deep Space 5, after being brought there from Kronos. A Federation citizen had been pulling a scam on several Klingon worlds, but escaped to Sector 221G. There, he was captured by the Nelkarites, who offered to extradite him. The offer was specifically made to Calhoun, since he, while in command of the previous ship called Excalibur, did a great service to the Nelkarite people. Calhoun had fully expected the Federation embassy on Kronos to send some flunky or other to perform so menial a task. But Ambassador Worf was a former Starfleet officer who attended the Academy with 3 of Excalibur's bridge officers. So he used this as an excuse to visit these friends. It was an unusually sentimental gesture for a Klingon, Calhoun thought, but he had also noticed that, in the months since the Dominion War ended, a lot of people were giving into sentiment who didn't used to. Computer, time, Worf said suddenly. The time is 19:22 hours. If you will excuse me, Captain, I have another engagement. Your little reunion? Worf nodded. Yes. He held out the now clean sword horizontally, the grip in his left hand, his right hand cradling the tip of the blade. I appreciate your allowing me to use your personal weapon. I hope I treated it with honor. Calhoun smirked as he took the sword by the grip. You made it out intact and the other guy didn't. That's as honorable as a weapon needs to be treated, if you ask me. He handed Worf the bat'leth. Thanks for letting me use this. I may need to replicate one of my own. A sword this versatile could come in handy someday. Taking the bat'leth, Worf said, You wielded the weapon like a true Klingon. Another hesitation. Before this mission is complete, Captain, if it would not be an imposition, I would be interested in hearing of your youthful exploits on Xenix. I have read your records, of course, but there is little substitute for a first-hand account. I could probably talk into it, if you give me a copy of that program. Very well. And, Calhoun added quickly, you tell me what it was like serving with Captain Shelby, back on the Enterprise. You're not the only one who values a first-hand account, Ambassador. This time, Worf definitely smiled. Of course. Then he proceeded toward a turbolift. Holding the sword up, Calhoun caught the reflection of his face in the blade, his beard broken by the scar caused by this very sword. Youthful exploits, huh? Yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it. Calhoun proceeded toward his own quarters for a shower. To old friends. Worf raised his mug filled with Warnog at Mark McHenry's toast. The two of them, along with Soleta and Zach Kebron, sat in the VIP quarters of the Excalibur, the largest accommodations available on the Galaxy-class vessel, which were naturally given over to a Federation ambassador. In his months at the post, he had finally started to grow accustomed to being treated as a dignitary, but he still felt unworthy of such opulence. Even his old quarters on the Enterprise, the same class as the Excalibur, were half this size, and those he considered unnecessarily lavish. To old friends, he said, gulping the Warnog. McHenry sipped his red wine, Kebron his scotch, and Soleta her Tarkalian tea. McHenry had urged her to have something with alcohol, which Soleta politely but firmly refused. "I still can't believe they made you an ambassador," Kebron said, looking at Worf. "Obviously, the diplomatic corps was desperate." "Nah, they just wanted someone who spoke the language," McHenry said. "His use of the universal translators makes such a consideration irrelevant, Mark." Soleta spoke with more affection than Worf would have expected. Soleta had always been the most Vulcan-like of Vulcans, but where the admonition she gave McHenry would have been a tart rebuke at the Academy, it was now the banter of shipmates. "Besides," Soleta continued, "Worf is uniquely qualified to serve in the position. He is one of the few who understands both the Federation and the Klingon Empire." Holding his scotch near his massive head, as if poised to drink more at a moment's notice, Kebron said, "As if anyone could understand the Klingon Empire." "I would certainly not expect you to understand it, Kebron," Worf said. "After all, the Empire is a complicated place." Grinning, McHenry said, "Don't look now, Zach, but I think he insulted you." "I disagree. I know he insulted me. Luckily, I'm considering the source." Soleta said, "We missed a large portion of the war thanks to a time-traveling mission, Worf. I am curious as to how the Romulans were convinced to join the war effort. It certainly came as a shock to us to find Romulan warbirds fighting alongside Starfleet and Klingon Defense Force vessels." "It was not an easy thing," Worf said. And he proceeded to tell the story of the discovery of a data rod in the wreckage of a Romulan senator's ship that showed the Dominion's unwillingness to abide by the non-aggression pact they'd signed with the Romulans. That led to McHenry and Kebron telling of the Excalibur's encounter with the Romulan renegade Sela, which in turn led Worf to tell of how the Enterprise first encountered Sela during a Klingon civil war, which led to Kebron telling stories of border conflicts between Brickar and the Klingon Empire during his youth, which led to McHenry telling a story about a propulsion drive project he was involved with as an ensign, which led to Soleta telling of her sojourns in Thelonian space, including a dramatic rescue from a Thelonian prison by Ambassador Spock, as well as its rather harrowing aftermath, which led to Worf telling of his own encounters with Spock, including a clandestine one involving time travel back to Deep Space Station K7 100 years in the past. "I hate time travel," McHenry said. "It gives me a backache." "Not a headache?" Kebron said. "Oh, no, because I need my head to do my job, but I don't really need my back, so I move the pain down there." "Given your usual behavior, Mark," Soleta said dryly, "I would think that the pain would be a meter or so lower." Worf had to admit he was enjoying this, falling into the conversational patterns of their youth, from Kebron and Worf trading insults, to McHenry not making any kind of sense, to Soleta playing the wry observer, mixed in with sharing stories of their adventures over the years. This is why we fight and struggle, so we have stories to tell when it is over. McHenry smiled. "Pity we couldn't contrive some way to get Tania on the ship. It'd be a real reunion of the old Timo Supremo." "I haven't heard from Tania since graduation," Kebron said. He looked at Worf and Soleta. "She went with you two on the Aldrin, as I recall." "Yes," Worf said. "I tried to track her down just before the war started," McHenry said, "right after that mess with the Prometheans. She was the chief engineer on the Appalachia, but she never returned my message." "Too bad," Kebron said. "I thought she was a little moon-eyed, but she was still pretty." "Tania Tobias is dead." McHenry and Kebron shot Soleta a look. Worf did not, as he already knew of her fate. As the Strategic Operations Officer on Deep Space Nine, one of the primary Federation outposts during the war, he was well aware of what ships were lost, and he distinctly remembered reading of the Appalachia's loss at the Ficus system. It happened so soon after Jetzia's death. "Geez, Soleta, why didn't you tell us?" McHenry asked. "I did not learn of it until after the previous Excalibur was destroyed. By the time we were reunited on this ship, other things had distracted me from my desire to share the information. My apologies." "As I recall," McHenry said, "she had the hots for you, Worf." "I beg your pardon," Worf said sharply. "Yes, I could never comprehend that," Kebron said. "Aside from her taste in lust objects, she was a sensible person at the Academy." "I was not a lust object of hers," Worf said firmly. "Well, maybe you didn't see it because you were so fixated on Kalar, but," Soleta interrupted, "I can assure you both that whatever infatuation Tania may have had with Worf did not survive our assignment to the Aldrin." Worf stared at the Vulcan woman. She spoke with such finality he wondered what it was she saw during their time on the Aldrin that he did not. Stardate 39022.5. Mind if I ask you a question, Ensign? Soleta turned to the security guard and said, I believe you just have. Excuse me. They were standing in one of the control rooms of an outpost that once had the designation T-22. Located on Calendra Minor, it had been a frontier outpost in the early days of the Federation, intended as a jumping-off point for colonization. Unfortunately, the bulk of the worlds beyond T-22 proved unsuitable for one reason or another. Federation expansion went in a different direction, and the outpost was eventually decommissioned a century ago. Now, however, the Cardassian Union, in their continued aggressive expansion that had been going on for the past 4 decades, was moving into the area of space the planet occupied. Given the Federation's continued hostilities with the Cardassians, Starfleet Command felt it might not be a bad idea to make Outpost T-22 a going concern again. To that end, a team from the U.S.S. Aldrin, an Oberth-class ship, was sent to the surface of Calendra Minor to evaluate the outpost and see if it could be salvaged and or upgraded, or if it needed to be scrapped and rebuilt entirely. While the team, led by the Aldrin's second officer, Lieutenant Ashante Shimura, performed that evaluation, the Aldrin itself was patrolling the sector to make sure that the Cardassian incursion into this sector wasn't farther along than intelligence reports indicated. The ship would return in 3 days to pick them up and return to Starbase 375 with a report. The away team consisted of Shimura, 5 enlisted engineers under the command of Ensign Tania Tobias, her first command situation, though Shimura was there to back her up as necessary, half a dozen security guards, led by Deputy Chief of Security Wheeler, the ship's con officer, Ensign Worf, who was there to gain away team experience, and 3 science officers, Soleta among them. Calendra Minor was a relatively small planet that was mostly covered in oceans, laced with an acidic compound that made the liquid fatal to most humanoid races. Indeed, the risks inherent in maintaining an outpost on a planet that was 80% covered in a lethal substance was one of the contributing factors to it being decommissioned. One of the landmasses was a 4 square kilometer island on which sat 15 buildings comprising Outpost T-22. At present, Soleta was assigned to the small structure that housed the environmental controls. Among T-22's manifold functions was to be a storage for goods en route to those colonies that never actually materialized, and the controls here maintained those storage facilities. The security guard assigned to be with her was a broad-shouldered human named Chan Pak. Pak had a flat face with features that seemed to have been intended for a head a quarter of the size of his actual cranium, resulted in wide cheeks and a massive jaw. Pak laughed at the Vulcan woman's response to his query, a piercing sound that made Soleta's ears hurt. You know, they warned me about you. Why is it that humans always feel the need to credit a nebulous they for so much? Of what did this warning consist, Mr. Pak? Well, they said that all you Vulcans are all pedantic. Soleta finished her scan of the console. Do they? You don't agree? Closing her tricorder, Soleta said, I have met many Vulcans who were not especially pedantic. Again, Pak laughed. Soleta felt constrained to move back a few decimeters to avoid further wear and tear on her eardrums. Fair enough. Anyhow, I wanted to ask about that pin in your hair. Feel free. Soleta knew it would save time and trouble if she simply went ahead and explained the pin, but she decided, in a fit of something like pique, to live up to the guard's characterization of her species. A third braying laugh. Until encountering non-Vulcans at Starfleet Academy, Soleta, as a Vulcan, had never comprehended why any language would need more than one word for laugh. Now, though, she understood. Chan Pak's particular version of the action was best classified as a guffaw. Fine. Ensign, what is the significance of that pin in your hair? Her hand unconsciously moved to the pin that secured her thick, long black hair. It belonged to my mother. She passed it on to me when I left for Starfleet Academy. The symbol is of the cornerstone of Vulcan philosophy. Thou shalt always be pedantic? Soleta was tempted to reply in the affirmative. No. It best translates into English as infinite diversity in infinite combinations. Since humans have a predilection for abbreviations that rivals my people's tendency towards pedantry, it has been simplified to IDIC. Oh, so that's what it means. I'd heard it before, but I never knew what it stood for. Pak scratched his expansive jaw with one massive finger. The guard's hands were unusually large, even for his already prodigious 2.3-meter height. I figured it was the Vulcan word for your planet or something. The Vulcan word for our planet is Vulcan, To call it otherwise would be illogical. Pack frowned. Well, humans call their planet Earth. I do not believe that anyone has ever accused your species of being illogical. The frown became a grin. Yeah, good point, well made. Not seeing any special need to continue this conversation, Soleta tapped her comm badge. Soleta to Shimura. Go ahead, Ensign. I have completed my examination. For a 2-century-old environmental control console that has been left unmaintained for 1 century, it is in remarkable condition. Meaning? Meaning it should be abandoned and replaced with a modern unit as soon as possible. What is remarkable is that it has not fallen to pieces. It should be moved to a museum as an example of the soundness of Starfleet structural engineering practices of the 22nd and 23rd centuries. Shimura laughed, though hers was a much more pleasant sound than that of Pack. Soleta stifled an urge to tell Pack to emulate it. I'll make a note of your recommendation, Ensign. Return to the main base. Most of the other teams are making similar reports. About the only thing that's actually working are the defensive and security protocols. And even so, they're still 100 years out of date. That is not entirely surprising. No, but it may mean we sit on our thumbs for 3 days until the Aldrin comes back. Quite possibly. Soleta out. Wow. Soleta turned to the security guard. Wow. Well, I thought for sure you made some kind of comment about how illogical it would be to sit on your thumbs. And why would I say such an idiotic thing, Mr. Pack? Soleta snapped. Pack recoiled as if he'd been punched in his immense jaw. I'm sorry, Ensign. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just making conversation. Were you? A piece of advice, Mr. Pack. Do not always listen to what they say. I have found... Whatever it was that Soleta had found was cut off by the sound of an explosion. Away team, report to the main building, now! That was Shimura's voice, coming over both Soleta and Pack's comm badges. More explosions could be heard through the tiny speakers. Worf, raise shields! Tobias, identify that thing! The phaser rifle that had been slung over Pack's shoulder was now firmly in the guard's oversized hands. Come on, Ensign! Without waiting to see if she was behind him, Pack ran for the exit to the small structure. Soleta followed, easily keeping up with the taller human's massive strides, and admonished herself for losing her temper the way she did. It was frustrating. She had always worked so hard to maintain the Vulcan disciplines, yet she lost control so easily. Others, who made far less effort than she, were able to keep their emotions in check so well they almost lived up to other species' stereotypes of Vulcan's robotic behavior. But for Soleta, it was always as if there was a volcano waiting to erupt in her heart. She supposed that was why she had always gotten along with Worf. The first Klingon in Starfleet, she and Worf, along with Tobias and 2 other classmates, had formed a study group and stuck together throughout their 4 years at the Academy. Worf, as a Klingon growing up among much more fragile humans, had to learn to keep his passions under control. In a way, it was much more difficult for him, as Vulcans had millennia to perfect the techniques for suppressing their emotions, where Worf had no cultural precedent to follow. Indeed, the very idea of suppressing emotions was anathema to most Klingons, but it was necessary for Worf to survive. Still, both of them had largely succeeded. Aside from moments I just had with Pack, but those moments had become more common of late. The ground shook. Soleta did not lose her footing, nor did Pack. She looked up to see that some kind of disruptor fire was striking a shield barrier, and the barrier was not holding up well. She could not see where the shots were coming from, though she did recognize the weapon type as either Klingon or Breen. Or Romulan, she added, though that was unlikely, all things considered. The Romulan Star Empire closed its borders after the Tomed incident 5 decades ago, though there had been occasional rumblings from them in the time since, mostly directed at the Klingon Empire. But this is far from either empire's sphere of influence. She and Pack entered the main control room. Shimura stood with Tobias, Worf, and 2 more security guards. The 2 ensigns were seated at the old-fashioned consoles with their toggle switches and blinking lights. Worf was the picture of calm intensity, sitting ramrod straight in his chair, the gold Klingon sash he wore over his red and black uniform bunching up a bit at the shoulder. Tobias was the opposite. Her blonde hair was tousled, and she looked more apprehensive than she had during finals week of their last year at the Academy. Shimura stood behind them, one hand resting on the backs of each of the ensigns' chairs. Her smooth almond skin seemed to be pulled tight over her high cheekbones. The 2 guards stood behind her, phaser rifles at the ready. Pack took up position next to them, while Soleta moved to stand just to the left of Shimura. The large view screen in front of the trio showed a tactical display, with a circle labeled Unidentified Vessel flying in a fairly standard attack pattern. Fly down toward the outpost, level off and do a strafing run on the outpost, fly back upward, circle around, and start again. Can we get any kind of reading? Shimura asked. No, Worf said. Sensors are unable to determine the ship's configuration. So it is a ship attacking, Soleta thought. That was the most logical deduction from the disruptor blast she and Pack had seen on their way here. The ground shook once more. Worf looked up at the ceiling, then at Shimura. Shields will not maintain integrity for much longer.
I'm amazed they held up this long,
Tobias said through gritted teeth.
These shields are older than dirt.
Soleta turned to Pack. Don't worry, I don't plan to comment on how illogical it would be to classify the shields as being of a greater age than the ground beneath our feet. Pack scowled at her. I wasn't going to, Ensign. Soleta noted the all-business tone and regretted her outburst. During the relative downtime of the outpost investigation, Pack was attempting to be friendly, albeit somewhat clumsily, but now that there was a crisis, he was all business. As I should be. She opened her tricorder and used it to scan the area immediately above, on the theory that her top-of-the-line tricorder was more sensitive than T-22's century-old sensors. After a moment, it told her something surprising. Sir, the vessel attacking us is a Romulan transport vessel, probably Golgarath class. Worf rose from his chair, his hand going to his phaser. Romulan! Mind your post, Ensign, Shimura snapped. What the hell are Romulans doing here? Shooting at us? Valbuena, one of the security guards, muttered. The Golgarath class is a civilian design, Lieutenant, Soleta said. It also dates back to a time when we had better intelligence on the Romulan Empire, and is therefore likely to be at least 50 years old. I would guess that it is not an official engagement with their military. The ship can theoretically hold up to 15 passengers, but I am only reading 2 life signs. 3 of the engineers came running in. One of them, a human woman named Maddox, said, Phaser banks are completely dead, sir. The torpedo bays are empty, and the firing system's offline. The ground shook with another impact. Shields are down to 15%, Tobias said, sounding frantic. Soleta could see a rivulet of sweat running down her forehead from her blonde hair. Another shot and we're dead. However, Maddox wasn't finished. But we've got an ion cannon in perfect working order. Soleta frowned. Shimura noticed this. Something wrong, Ensign? An ion cannon would be consistent with the construction date of this outpost, Lieutenant. However, I question the description of it as in perfect working order, given that the weapon's very unreliability is what led to its falling out of common usage. Maybe, Ensign, Maddox said with a grin, but it beats a kick in the head. Speaking of which, Tobias said, we're about to get kicked in the head. They're coming in for another pass. Worf pointed at one set of controls on his station. Are these the ion cannon controls? Sounding surprised that Worf deduced this on his own, Maddox said, yeah, that's it. Soleta almost smiled at that. Worf's aptitude for weapon systems was impressive, though not something that had come up much in his time as a con officer on the Aldrin. His range of study had been broad at the Academy, preparing him for both the command track he was presently on, or for a career in security at which Soleta suspected he would be more comfortable. Fire when ready, Mr. Worf, Shimura said. Yes, sir, the young Klingon spoke with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. The ground shook much harder from the firing of the ion cannon than from the Romulan barrage. Sparks flew from the console, blowing Worf and the chair in which he sat, as well as Shimura, who was standing behind him, backward. Worf! Tobias cried. I am all right. See to the lieutenant. Soleta, however, was already doing so. Shimura had burns on her forehead and cheek and was unconscious. She looked up at Pack and the 2 next to him. We need to take her to the infirmary. Afraid not, said a voice from the doorway. Soleta turned to see the squat, bulky form of Tynan Wheeler, the Aldrin's deputy security chief, who had entered along with one other security guard. The infirmary was trashed on that last shot when the shields went down. Jansen, DeBacco, Quirrell, Lieutenant Ordonez, and Ensign Tania were all in there when it went up. Everyone except Soleta and Worf looked up in shock at that. Jansen and DeBacco were 2 of the engineers. Quirrell was a security guard. Ordonez and Tania were the other members of Soleta's science team. Tobias ran back to her console and peered into the old-fashioned sensor hood, blue light shining on her face. Damn it, confirmed. They fired just as the ion cannon hit them. The Romulan ship has gone down, but they took out the infirmary and 2 of the barracks. And both the shields and the ion cannon are fried. Soleta turned to Tobias. What are your orders, Ensign? Tobias whirled around, her blonde hair bouncing with the action. Her face was still covered in sweat. My orders? With Lieutenant Shimura unconscious, and both Lieutenant Ordonez and Ensign Tania dead, that leaves only you, me, and Ensign Worf as ranking officers. You are in command of the engineering team, which is the primary component of this away team. Therefore, logic dictates that you should be the one to take command for as long as the lieutenant is incapacitated. Right. Okay. Tobias took a moment to compose herself. A moment more than she probably should have, in Soleta's opinion, but this was hardly an expected turn of events, and then looked at the Klingon. Ensign Worf, you will lead the damage control team, assess our situation, see if the shields can be repaired, and try to fix the ion cannon. Aye, sir, Worf said with a curt nod. He gave another nod to Maddox and the other engineers, who fanned out. To Wheeler, she said, Chief, search the wreckage of the Romulan ship for survivors. What if we find some? Tobias hesitated. Soleta jumped in.
Lieutenant Shimura indicated that security protocols were still intact. That means the brigs are working?
Wheeler nodded.
Yeah, and they're still in one piece. All right, then, bring any prisoners there, Tobias said.
Yes, sir. Wheeler led Pack and the others out.
Soleta, try to keep Lieutenant Shimura comfortable. There's a first aid kit in here somewhere.
Of course, Ensign. She scanned the room for the material that would be found in such a kit and quickly found it located under one of the secondary consoles. Standard placement.
And Soleta?
The ensign turned to face her former classmate.
Yes, Tania.
Thanks a lot. Smiling grimly, Tobias turned back to the console. Soleta did not bother pointing out that her actions were wholly logical. It wouldn't do to come across as pedantic, after all. Tania Tobias sat dolefully looking at the console. She felt guilty every time she touched one of the ancient controls, convinced that the museum guard would yell at her not to touch the exhibits. But no, she thought, these are all real working components. Well, some of them are, anyhow. To her continued annoyance, many of the colored lights were not lit, meaning that they were dead, or were lit with red rather than green illumination, meaning they were not working properly.
Hell of a first command.
A deep, booming, yet gentle voice said, Tania. Tobias turned around to see Worf and Soleta standing side by side. For a moment, she imagined that they were back at the academy, getting ready for a class along with Zack and Mark. But no, they weren't cadets anymore. They had the single pips indicating their status as commissioned officers in Starfleet, not mere plebes. And they wore the uniforms of Command Red, Worf, Sciences Blue, Soleta, and Operations Gold, herself. Not the plain red and white of cadets. People are dead and injured. No, this is as real as it gets. More than ever, she wanted to just collapse in Worf's arms and have herself a good cry. But officers didn't do that, and she had long since lost the opportunity to tell Worf how she felt. She doubted that he viewed her as anything other than a friend. Not that it was easy to tell how Worf felt. Ever since his and Kalar's rather nasty breakup, he had gotten more withdrawn and stony, if that were even possible. Taking a deep breath through her nose and exhaling it in a burst through her mouth, Tobias said, Report. Communications are completely inoperable. The subspace transmitter and receiver were both destroyed in the final attack.
Damn.
Soleta's right eyebrow raised.
I assume Lieutenant Shimura sent a distress call when the Romulan first attacked.
Of course, Worf said.
But we don't know if anyone replied to it, Tobias added, or even heard it. Nothing salvageable?
Maddox and her team are attempting to do so, but she was not optimistic. Tobias slumped her shoulders and then straightened.
Damn it, I'm in command. I need to look like it.
True, it was just Worf and Soleta. If there was anyone else who would let her off the hook, if there was anyone who would let her off the hook for not being completely spit and polish, it would be those two. Though, she mused, they would probably be disappointed. She decided that that would be even worse, and she forced herself to keep her best command face on, assuming I even have one. She turned to Soleta.
How is Lieutenant Shimura?
Not good. The tricorder readings indicate a subdural hematoma. It is possible that a skilled surgeon might be able to treat this problem with the limited supplies we have available. It is quite impossible for anyone presently on the planet to do so, unless one of the Romulans in that transport is a doctor. Unlikely, Worf said with a sneer. And even if one was, I would not trust such a creature to operate on the lieutenant. Tobias almost physically recoiled from the bile in Worf's tone. She knew, of course, that Worf was the only survivor of the massacre on Kittimer by Romulan forces, which claimed his parents' lives. Her own father had been the chief engineer of the U.S.S. Intrepid, the vessel that rescued him. And she had certainly seen Worf angry in the 5+ years they'd known each other. However, the level of pure hatred he was giving off now was palpable. That would be unwise, Soleta said dryly. Let's just hope the Aldrin heard our distress signal and is heading back, Tobias said ruefully. Even if they are, Soleta said, the soonest we can expect them is in 23 hours, 4 minutes, assuming they followed a standard search pattern and received the distress call when the attack began, and then proceeded back to Calandra Minor at maximum warp. Worf asked, can you keep Lieutenant Shimura alive until then? It is beyond my means to keep her alive, Worf, Soleta said with as much incredulity as she was ever likely to display publicly. I can keep her comfortable indefinitely, but until the hematoma becomes serious enough to endanger her life, then she will die. An idea suddenly struck Tobias.
What about the Romulan ship?
What about it? Worf asked.
If you were inquiring as to whether or not they might have medical equipment that would aid us, it is unlikely. The Golgarath-class vessels were not equipped with sick bays or dispensaries. The best we could hope for is a medikit similar to the one we have, and it would probably only be equipped for Romulans, and perhaps Remans and other Romulan subject species. It is unlikely to be of any use for treating a human. And even if it did, came a voice from the doorway, it wouldn't be intact. Tobias turned to see Wheeler entering the building, blood staining part of his uniform over his left shoulder. Behind him, Suktio was carrying Balbuena in a firefighter's carry. Balbuena was covered and burned. "What happened?" she asked, even as Worf went to assist Suktio in setting Balbuena down next to Shimura on the far side of the room. Tobias wondered where Pack and Melnick were. Wheeler looked like a spring about to uncoil. His teeth were practically clenched as he gave his report. "The ROM ship was completely trashed. There's nothing in there we can use, not even the comm systems. Unfortunately, its passengers weren't trashed, and neither were their disruptors." The deputy chief shook his head and looked away. "They vaporized Melnick, and Balbuena and I took a couple of glancing hits." Balbuena looked like she'd taken considerably more than that, but Tobias said nothing. "One of them got away, but we captured the other one. Pack's keeping an eye on him in the brig." Soleta walked over to Tobias. "Balbuena has several burns of varying degrees. I can do little for her here. Like Lieutenant Shimura, she either needs a trained physician or the Aldrin sickbay, preferably both." She ran her tricorder over Wheeler. "You, Chief, need a microsuture and a dermal regenerator, and you'll be fine." "I'll handle it myself," Wheeler said, teeth still clenched. "Where's the medikit?" "That would be illogical," Soleta said. "I don't give a damn about logic right now, Ensign. Those bastards killed several of my people. I can lick my own damn wounds." To Tobias' surprise, Soleta snapped, "Forget logic then, Chief. That would be incredibly stupid. You have a shoulder wound. You would have to treat it one-handed, which would be awkward at best." Quickly, Tobias added, "At least let Suktio do it." She gave the guard in question a quick look, and he quickly grabbed the medikit off the floor and approached Wheeler with it. "Fine, whatever," Wheeler muttered. "But we need to get out after that other one. We found half a dozen crates in the wreckage. Most of them were just as trashed as the ships, but they had labels and manifests that were from all over the place. Cardassian, Lessepian, Asfar-Katala, a bunch I didn't recognize. I'm thinking smugglers." "That would explain their presence so far from Romulan space," Worf said. "As well as their use of an old civilian-issue vessel," Soleta added. Tobias bit her lower lip. "Mr. Wheeler's right. We need to find the other one." Worf scowled. If we are to conduct a proper search, we must utilize all remaining personnel." Wheeler nodded, shaking off Suktio, who was putting the finishing touches on his shoulder. "The ensign's right. I think it's safe to say that these guys have been using this planet as a base of operations. Probably got pissed that we horned in on their territory. That means we're going to need a search party of at least 8. And since there are only 9 of us left..." Again, Tobias bit her lip. Normally, this would be a job for security, but their numbers had been cut in half. She remembered enough of her tactical training at the Academy to know that in this terrain, 4 two-person search parties was the most efficient way to search the island. "All right." She thought a moment. 3 security guards, 3 engineers, best to double them up. "Chief, you and Maddox go north. Suktio, take Chulor and head west. Have Pack take Schechter east. Worf and I will handle the south. Soleta, you stay here and keep an eye on Balbuena and Lieutenant Shimura." "Someone needs to guard the prisoner," Worf said emphatically. "He cannot be allowed to escape." Wheeler said, "Worf's right." "I will guard the prisoner," Soleta said. "If Shimura or Balbuena's condition deteriorates, there is quite literally nothing I can do. However, I can guard the prisoner and also interrogate him." Disdainfully, Wheeler asked, "What the hell do you know about interrogation, Ensign?" "I know that it is best conducted in a dispassionate, logical manner, and that I am the best candidate for such a task." "No, those of us with training are best suited." Soleta raised an eyebrow. "As I recall, Chief, your exact words a few minutes ago were, 'I don't give a damn about logic right now, Ensign. Those bastards killed several of my people.' Hardly the statement of an objective interrogator." Wheeler moved closer to Soleta so that he was staring right down at her. "So what are you going to do? Tell him he's stupid and hope he cracks?" Speaking with a violent fury that Tobias would have sooner expected from Worf, Soleta said, "Chief, remove yourself from my immediate vicinity, or I will show you how painful a Vulcan neck pinch is on someone with an injured shoulder." "That's enough!" Tobias yelled. "Soleta's right. We need someone to interrogate the prisoner, and I'd rather all 3 security personnel were involved in the search. Does the brig have a monitoring station?" It took Wheeler a moment to realize that she had addressed the question to him, busy as he was staring daggers at Soleta. Yeah, there's one." "Good. Soleta, keep it trained on this room so you can monitor Shimura and Balbuena." Tobias stared at Wheeler, whose gaze remained fixed on Soleta. "Is there any particular reason why you're still standing here, Chief?" Wheeler shook his head as if coming out of a trance. No, sir." "You've got your orders. Move it." Quickly, Wheeler departed, Suktio right on his heels. Well, if that isn't my command face, it was obviously good enough, Tobias thought with satisfaction. Then she turned to Soleta and Worf and let the command face fall. You know, I keep waiting for an instructor to walk in and say, "Computer, end simulation." In a tone as gentle as her words to Wheeler were harsh, Soleta said, "This is why we went through those simulations, Tania." "I know." She exhaled a long breath. "Come on, let's do this." Soleta felt a pang of shame as she entered the brig. Pack was already there, along with Schuster from engineering. They departed to commence their search for the other Romulan, leaving Soleta alone with the prisoner. The structure included a small workstation with an old-fashioned viewer protruding upward from the computer console, and 3 cells framed by force field generators. The cells included modest toilet facilities and an uncomfortable-looking bench. In one of them sat a Romulan. Soleta's pang of shame was because she lied to Tobias. Pax they would insist that Vulcans never lie, of course, but what kind of pedants would we be if we did not? She did not wish to interrogate the Romulan because she was best qualified for the job, or because logic dictated that she be the one to do so, though those were both true. No, she wished to interrogate the Romulan because she'd never seen one before. What she saw in the middle of the 3 brigs now was a sight she never imagined. A Vulcan with a vicious, nasty smile on his face. He wasn't Vulcan, of course, but one could not discern that upon first glance, any more than one could tell a human from a Betazoid on first glance. Except for that smile. The smile branded him as a Romulan, for Soleta could not believe that even the most undisciplined of Vulcans, one who had utterly discarded the teachings of Surak and the ways of logic, would ever be capable of so contemptible a smile. Well, the Romulan said. "A Vulcan! Pretty one, too. And young, based on that single pip on your collar. Pretty young Vulcan. Very nice, yes. You're much prettier than that human bitch I had to teach a lesson to." "Yes, that one." This last was added as Soleta activated the viewer and programmed it to transmit from the main base, specifically Balbuena and Shimura's prone forms. She also placed her tricorder on the workstation and set it to record everything that went on in the room. The brig's security system was doing likewise, but her tricorder was of more recent vintage and therefore more likely to provide a useful recording. "She shot at me. I don't like it when women shoot at me. Women are meant to be subject to men's whims, after all. If you are endeavoring to get an emotional reaction out of me, you are bound to fail." "You think so, do you?" The Romulan laughed at that. It was a vile sound that made Soleta nostalgic for Pack. "I may change your mind about that." "Unlikely." The Romulan leaned back on the bench, resting the top of his head against the wall. "I assume you're not here to provide me with entertainment, Ensign, which is a pity, as I suspect you'd be very entertaining, so you may as well get to it. You want to know who I am and what I'm doing here, yes? And why you fired on this outpost." Grinning, the Romulan said, "Oh, that's easy. We fired on you because you were trespassing on our property." Soleta raised an eyebrow. "This is a Federation outpost." "Oh, correction, an abandoned Federation outpost. You people haven't come anywhere near this place in 100 years, so it's ours by any reasonable interpretation of interstellar salvage law." He leaned forward. "You know, I must say, I prefer this version of the Starfleet uniform over that maroon atrocity you people wore for so long. The skin-tight look is much more flattering, especially on you. Admittedly, it doesn't leave much to the imagination, but I prefer reality to imagination in any case. Now I know exactly what to expect when I have you." The Romulan continued to speak in a natural tone of voice, not varying in the slightest when he modulated from his discourse on salvage rights to his positive opinion of Soleta's physical form. She asked, "Do you truly imagine that you will get that opportunity?" "Well, Veretta's still free. We've been avoiding Starfleet for 60 years. I can't see that changing now." Soleta allowed herself the tiniest of smiles. "I would say that your vision is limited." Again, he laughed. It was no more pleasant the second time. "Oh, very good! And here I was worried." "About what?" "Do you know what we say on Romulus about Vulcans?" "I am quite sure that I do not." Rising from the bench, the Romulan said, "That the sundering of our people from yours came about because we found you so insufferably boring." "But you are not in the least bit boring, Ensign." Soleta turned to look at the monitor for a moment, then turned back. "You said your comrade's name was Verett. What is yours?" "Rajari." "You provide that information with surprising ease." Shrugging, Rajari said, "It's of little consequence, Besides, I want you to scream my name when you... You are pathetic, Soleta said suddenly. Rajari's eyes widened. Ho-ho! What's this? Is that a bit of vitriol I see seeping through the cracks of that Serachian facade? Tamping down the anger that had built in that inner volcano of hers, Soleta said, Hardly. Oh, you can't fool me, Ensign. He walked right up to the edge of the force field, a few wisps of his black and gray hair raising and moving toward the field from the static electricity. There's a monster lurking in your heart, just like in every Vulcan. You may have spent centuries trying to bury it, but it's there. You'd be much better off letting it loose. Considering she'd spent a lifetime burying it, Soleta was hardly likely to take that advice. The conversation was, however, providing fascinating insights into the Romulan psyche. Sadly, that was not her purpose here. What is your business on this planet? Back to the dull interrogator. Rajari started to pace the cell. Such a pity this force field is here. The first thing I do, of course, is remove that hairpin and let your hair down. You have lovely hair, Ensign. Although I must say, I like the pin, too. It reminds me of someone. Soleta's eyebrow raised. An idic symbol reminds you of your person. No, the hairpin itself, actually. You see, while I am the first Romulan you've ever encountered, and don't try to deny it, Ensign, even through your attempt at a cool exterior, I could see the eagerness in your eyes. One of our evil cousins has been captured. I can study him. He shook his head and started to pace the cell. Given the small dimensions, he turned around quite a bit. Vulcans. In any case, while I am your first Romulan, you are hardly my first Vulcan. You're not even my first Vulcan woman wearing an idic pin in her hair. The other one was this magnificent woman on KRAD 9. Scratching his left ear, he looked pensive for a moment, staring at the side wall as if it would provide insight. That must have been, 20, 25 years ago now? No, 25. Definitely. It was right after we stole that Klingon shuttle. Verret was off on some other mission, and I was in a one-person ship that crashed on KRAD. It was a small Vulcan colony, only a few hundred people on it. He laughed sadistically and resumed his pacing. There was this scientist who came to my aid after the crash, a gray-eyed beauty named Tobias. She had a pin in her hair, just like yours, with that silly symbol on it. I removed it, of course, along with her clothing. She put up a fight, but it was to no avail. Men are superior to women, after all, and Romulans are superior to Vulcans. Most don't appreciate how weak Vulcans are, since their strength is greater than most. But strength without passion is no strength at all. He grinned. And I had plenty of passion. So did she, actually, eventually. Turning to look back at Soleta, he finished, I can assure you, I succeeded in getting an emotional reaction out of her. Soleta, who was born to Tobias of the KRAD 9 colony 2.5 decades previous, stared into the eyes of the man on the other side of the force field. Eyes that were the same deep black as her own. Tobias, as Rajari had already noted, had gray eyes, as had Soleta's maternal grandmother. Her maternal grandfather had green eyes. Tobias's husband, Volak, had brown eyes, as had both his own parents. Soleta had never met a relative with such black eyes as her own. She had also never given it much thought, assuming to have inherited them from a relative of whose eye color she was unaware. Having grown up on KRAD, she had met very few members of her family in any event. A rage beyond anything Soleta had ever felt in her life, even as a child before she had been old enough to know the mental disciplines that all Vulcan children were taught, started to build within her. Reaching deep down within the recesses of her being, Soleta summoned all the years of discipline, of training, of experience, and suppressing the emotions that were always far closer to the surface than her teachers seemed to think they should have been, in order to keep her reaction to this news from showing on her person. Somehow, she managed to simply raise an eyebrow and keep her voice controlled as she said, Indeed. Rajari threw his head back and laughed. Perfect! Exactly the reaction I expected. I described the brutal rape of one of your people, and all you can do is that damn thing with your eyebrows. They teach that at schools on Vulcan, I wonder? He sat back down on the bench. No matter. You obviously aren't interested in turning this force field off, so I have nothing more to say. On the contrary, I want very much to turn the force field off so I can beat you until my fists are green with your blood. Besides, he added, now laying down on the bench and closing his eyes, his black eyes, his eyes that he passed on to the daughter he didn't even realize he had, his daughter who was standing right there in front of him. Verret will likely kill you all off and free me in short order. Knowing it was a violation of her orders, she turned and left the brig. She could not stand to be in the same room as him, not and still restrain herself from killing him. All these years, thinking my own discipline was lacking, when in fact it was him! Romulan passion, an inheritance from my father, along with my mysterious black eyes. Questions flooded her mind. Why did my parents not tell me of this? Why did Mother go through with the pregnancy? Most critical of all, what do I do now? Starfleet regulations required that its personnel report their full heritage, particularly if a member of a hostile species is in that heritage. Though the Romulans had kept their borders closed for over 50 years, they definitely fell into the category of hostile where the Federation was concerned. But revealing her parentage now, assuming it was true, a call home would verify it since she doubted her parents would deny it if she confronted them directly, would have dire consequences. Indeed, it had had consequences already. As time went on, Soleta had found her control deteriorating. She had assumed it to be the byproduct of living among so many emotional beings, but what if it wasn't that? What if it is simply my father's birthright asserting itself? And even if it isn't, what happens when the wrong person gets on my wrong side? What happens the next time someone asks me about Vulcans as Pac did, or challenges my logic in as aggressive a manner as Wheeler, and I cannot control my emotions? Suddenly, Soleta felt very alone. For the first time in her career, in her life, she did not know what to do. Tania Tobias watched as Worf took the point. They were heading up an incline that, according to the outpost maps, would lead to a cliff. The dirt and grass path they now took was lined on either side by trees, and it looked like it had been used as a walkway once, but allowed to grow over with disuse. It would have reminded Tobias of some forest she had been to back on Earth, but for the leaves and grass being bright yellow and the tree bark being a russety red. Worf stopped walking as they came to the end of the road. They stood before a sheer 40-meter drop into the heavily acidic ocean. Tobias could hear waves breaking on the rocks below, and she shuddered. Even being caught in the spray of those waves would burn the skin off a human. She walked up beside Worf, brushing her blonde hair out of her face as the wind changed so that it was blowing from behind her. She wished she'd had the forethought to secure her hair before they left, but it wasn't windy back at the main base. Something is wrong, Worf said while peering at his tricorder. What is it? She asked. The wind has shifted. I can smell several avians in the trees about 6 meters to our right, but they are not registering on the tricorder at all. Tobias knew that Klingons had superior olfactory senses. Worf said it aided in hunting, though Tobias never understood why any post-industrial society would engage in such an activity, but it never occurred to her to put it to practical use like this before. So if the tricorder's not picking them up, it means there's something nearby that's masking lifeform readings. Yes. We should... Worf's words were cut off by the Romulan, who leapt out from behind one of the red-barked yellow-leaf trees and tackled him. A Klingon and a human with brains. What are the odds? The Romulan said after punching Worf in the face following the tackle. Tobias unholstered her phaser, but the Romulan was unbelievably fast and knocked it out of her hands before she could fire. It clattered off one of the trees and ricocheted beyond her reach. The Romulan then grabbed her in a chokehold, which she proceeded to break easily with a move she learned her first year at the Academy. She faced off against the Romulan, who grinned. Not bad for a slow human. He lunged at her, and she dodged out of the way, ever mindful of the nearby cliff. Have to maneuver him away from it. A phaser blast on stun then struck the Romulan in the side. The Romulan stumbled, but did not fall down. Tobias stared wide-eyed at the Romulan for half a second, which was all he needed to grab her and put a disruptor muscle to her neck. They were now standing right at the cliff's edge. Worf was still lying on the ground, yellow grass stains on his black and red uniform, holding his phaser at them. That's enough, Klingon. Make one more move and the human dies. If anything happens to her, you will die, Romulan. Worf spoke with as much venom as Tobias had ever heard from him. And if I let her go, you'll still try to kill me. Definitely, Worf said. You are Romulan Patak, and I will not rest until you are exterminated. Now, what did I ever do to you, Klingon? Your people are the detritus of the galaxy. Worf got to his feet, his tone growing even harsher, his phaser never wavering. You were responsible for the massacre of my family. I suppose it's possible, the Romulan said pensively. I've killed many Klingons in my time. It's not difficult. You lot tend to lead with your chins. In any case, you can't hurt me. And if you don't lower your phaser, I'll shoot this human. Go ahead. Tobias felt the blood drain from her face. What is he doing? Worf had to be bluffing, she thought, even as she could hear his deep voice proclaiming that Klingons never bluffed. But this man had already proven that he had no compunctions about killing them with the attack on the base, and now that he'd leapt from the trees... Then Tobias realized why Worf said what he said, and elbowed the Romulan in the stomach. As expected, he doubled over, his fingers spasming on the disruptor's firing button, and nothing happening. Because if his disruptor had power, he'd have shot us from under cover instead of a frontal assault. Good deduction, Worf. Tobias ran to Worf's side. He still held the phaser on the Romulan, who was still at the cliff's edge, clutching his stomach. "Fine! You saw through my ruse," he said in a strained voice, tossing his powerless disruptor off to the side. "But the same field that masked my life signs is also proof against your weapon. So what's it to be, Klingon?" "Your death." Romulan then shot the ground at the Romulan's feet. The brown dirt and yellow grass burned away from the amber beam of the phaser, causing the Romulan to stumble backward. He pinwheeled his arms in an attempt to regain a balance that had suddenly been taken from him. Tobias ran to grab him, to try to save him, wondering what the hell Worf was thinking, even as the Romulan fell over the cliff. But she was too late. The Romulan didn't scream until after he hit the water. Turning and facing her friend with a fury she had never felt before, she asked, "Worf, what the hell did you just do?" "Cleaned up the galaxy by eliminating one more Romulan." With that, he turned and headed back down the pathway. As it turned out, the Aldrin had heard T-22's initial distress signal and returned to Calandra Minor at maximum warp, arriving exactly 23 hours and 4 minutes from the time Soleta predicted. The ensign tried to take solace in the fact that her Vulcan training had gone that far, at least. Shimura and Balbuena were both brought to sickbay in time to be healed, the former just barely, the latter with a somewhat longer recovery period. Upon awakening, Shimura recommended that all surviving members of the away team receive commendations, and the dead ones receive posthumous honors. Rajari, who was somewhat devastated at the news of Veret's untimely demise in the acid oceans of Calandra Minor, was transferred to the Aldrin brig. After the memorial service for her 6 deceased crewmates, Soleta went to visit Rajari, but found herself unable to say anything. The Romulan just laughed at her, and then she left. Then she contacted her parents on Vulcan on a secure channel. The conversation was very calm and rational and logical, and Soleta managed not to scream as Topass and Volak confirmed that Soleta was indeed the result of the rape committed by Rajari. Not screaming took more willpower than Soleta knew she had, particularly when Mother asked if they would want her to testify to the rape. Soleta managed to calmly assure her that it wouldn't be necessary to reveal this information, as Rajari's firing on a Federation outpost and killing Starfleet personnel, not to mention assorted outstanding warrants dating back some 60 years, would be more than sufficient to keep him locked up for the rest of his natural life. Soleta did not ask why they went ahead with having her after the rape. She thought that if she did, it would shred the tattered remains of her self-control. Right after she signed off with her parents, she composed her request for a leave of absence from Starfleet. The door chime rang in the middle of that. "Come," she said automatically, not really wanting to see anyone, but unable to contrive an excuse to keep anyone out. It was Tania. "Soleta, can I talk to you for a second?" "About what?" "Worf." Soleta raised an eyebrow. "I have told you in the past, Tania. If you wish to let him know your true feelings..." No, it's not that," Tobias said with a wave of her hand. She then told Soleta about what happened on Calandra Minor, and what Worf did to Veret. "Worf was true to his nature," Soleta said. "Klingons are firm believers in vengeance, and he sees Romulans as responsible for the death of his family. It's a blood debt." "That's sick!" Tania Tobias was a good person, and someone whom Soleta had shared many adventures with, and with whom she was proud to serve. But enough was enough. "It is who he is," Soleta said angrily. "If you care for him as much as you claim to, then you must accept that. If you don't, then it's past time you got over your tiresome infatuation and got on with your life." Tobias recoiled as if she'd been struck. Not surprising, since Soleta was feeling an overwhelming urge to strike her. "Soleta, what's gotten into you?" "My father." "Nothing, Tania. Nothing at all. I'm merely trying to convey what you saw on Calandra Minor was Worf as he truly is, and me as I truly am." "People can change, Soleta," Tobias said defensively. "We don't have to be slaves to our nature." With that, she turned and left Soleta's quarters. If only I believed that. She finished composing the LOA request. Stardate 53405.9. Eventually, the reunion broke up.
All 3 officers had to report for duty first thing in the morning, after all, and they were due to arrive at Nelcar shortly after Alpha Shift began. Kebrin was the first to leave, followed by McHenry. Soleta remained behind after McHenry's departure, ostensibly to finish her drink, but Worf could sense she had something to say to him in private. "You've changed, Worf," she finally said. "I could never imagine you even accepting a diplomatic post when you were at the Academy, much less thriving in one. You used to insist on being Klingon at all costs. Now I see in you someone who has taken on the best of both the Federation and the Klingon Empire." Her lips curled slightly. "I'm impressed." "Thank you." "I find myself reminded of something Tania and I discussed on the Aldrin, shortly before I took my leave of absence. I told her that people had to be true to their nature, but she insisted that people could change. It would seem that, for you at least, she was right." Soleta exited the VIP quarters then, leaving a very confused Worf behind. From the moment he first encountered her on the shuttle trip to San Francisco on his way to the Academy, he had never truly understood Soleta. She seemed to be so much more than a typical Vulcan, and yet such a typical Vulcan. Worf shook his head as he removed his leather coat and prepared himself for sleep. "I have never understood Vulcans. I think I would sooner understand a Romulan." The story without that framing sequence, so without the bits in present day, as it were cut from the story. So the parts with the Aldrin crew on Outpost T-22 is in New Frontier, No Limits, short story anthology, which has basically solo stories featuring a bunch of the different characters. Dayton Ward did a Calhoun story. Lauren Coleman did a Shelby story. There's another Soleta story that also features Spock that Susan Schwartz wrote. Terry Osborne wrote a Solar story that also features Q, Lady Q, both characters played by Susie Plaxton. David Mack wrote a hilarious Zach Kebrin story. It's maybe the best story in the book. It's just brilliant. And a whole bunch more. And Peter David also wrote a story. It was the story of Calhoun and Shelby's honeymoon. The honeymoon from hell that they had. Thank you very much for watching. This was a bit longer than usual, but I think it was worth it. Check me out online at DeCandido.net. You can read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. And please, if you can support me on Patreon.com/KRAD, that would be awesome. Please stay safe and take care.